Welcome everyone to our webinar on late extenuating circumstances appeals being run by the Student Union Advice Service. So today we're just going to talk through a late extenuation appeal and also just kind of cover what extenuation is for those of you who might not already be familiar. So extenuation or extenuating circumstances is the process by which students can officially inform the university that they've been experiencing significant personal circumstances which have been having a detrimental impact on their ability and capacity to study. So in particular, and what's most common that we see here in the advice service, is them having a detrimental impact on their capacity to complete and submit assessments on time, but this can also apply to exams as well. Generally, when we're talking about extenuating circumstances, we need to see that they fall into the following three categories. So, is it unforeseeable, unpreventable, and does it have a serious impact? If it ticks these boxes, then it is generally considered extenuation. So when it comes to extenuation, there are two processes. There's a standard extenuation process and a late extenuation appeal process. So for the purpose of this webinar, we're talking about a late EC appeal. And it's important to note that there are extenuation deadlines for each semester. And if you've missed the deadline, the process by which you apply for extenuation is slightly different. So a late extenuation appeal is when a student needs to apply for extenuating circumstances, but they have missed the deadline by which they could have applied for extenuation via the standard process. So once that deadline is passed, students need to use this appeals process to submit their claims. Otherwise, the claim will be rejected if it's done through the standard process. So we've talked a little bit about what extenuating circumstances is as a whole, and we just want to give you a couple of examples now about the most common types that we see here in the advice service. This list is not exhaustive by any means, but these are just our most common types that we see. So the first one is physical health issues. So for example, a major surgery or an ongoing physical health issue. The second is mental health issues, and we have seen a rise in this over the last year and a bit. There's an accident, so this is some kind of physical accident like a traffic accident that generally might require that you go to hospital or you're incapacitated for a time. And then the last one is bereavement, which is the loss of a family member or a friend. As I said previously, this list is not exhaustive and there are other significant circumstances that could be considered extenuation. So for example, things like homelessness, if you've experienced significant trauma, if you suddenly become a carer, or that there's been changes to your caregiving arrangements quite suddenly. Generally, if you're trying to determine if your circumstances do fall into this extenuating circumstances bracket, I'd refer you back to the three categories before. So is it unforeseeable, is it unpreventable, and does it have a serious impact? If it ticks those boxes, then yes, it is extenuating circumstances. And just as it's good to be aware of what is extenuation, it's also important that you know what is not. And if you submit a claim on the basis of any of the following examples, it's unlikely that you're going to receive a successful outcome. So the first two kind of go together. That's moving house and holidays. These are not unforeseeable, as we generally know when we're doing either of these things. And also you should be aware of when your assessments are due way before. So you have plenty of time to work your holidays and moving house around these deadlines. The third one would be computer failure. So the university expects that every student is able to access the correct technology, so a laptop and a stable Wi-Fi connection, and also that they should be accounting for any possible technology failures when it comes to submitting. So for example, if you're leaving it till the last minute to submit your work and your computer, stops working, the university would take the stance that you were responsible for obviously making sure you had access to a computer, or that with such short notice you're able to access an alternative. Similarly, when you're working, if you are typing away on your essay and your laptop blue screens and you lose all of your work, the university would take the stance that you should be backing up your work either via a USB, or you can do this through some online platforms such as Google Drive, OneDrive. There's also Dropbox that you could use. Any of these would be sufficient. And then the last one is minor illnesses, so things such as cold or hay fever. We understand that obviously you might not feel very well when you have a cold, but generally they're not considered to be major illnesses, and so shouldn't be having a huge impact on your ability to engage with your studies. So when we're talking about extenuation deadlines, if you're watching this webinar, it's likely that you've passed the deadline by which you could submit extenuation via the standard process. So you will need to submit via the appeals process instead. Like I said earlier, if you try to submit via the standard process when your extenuation deadline has passed, your claim will be rejected as being out of time. So it's important that you're aware of when your deadlines are for each extenuation. So each semester has its own deadline for extenuation, and if you're not sure of when these are, you can view them through our SU extenuation webpage, and it's just good to be aware of when they are and to make sure obviously that you are aware if it has passed that you need to go through this appeals process.
So what will you need to submit your appeal? So some of it is quite obvious. Obviously, you'll need some personal details, information around the modules and the assessment of which you're wanting the extenuation to apply. But something we wanted to highlight was the need for evidence. In most instances, you will need to provide evidence to support your claim. So support letters from a GP or a mental health professional, hospital discharge letters, a death certificate in the case of bereavement. You may be able to use an order of service related to a funeral, things around that. So things get a little bit more complicated with a late extenuation appeal. And it's generally that you'll not only need evidence for your circumstances, but also evidence for why you were able to submit were unable to submit by the extenuation claim deadline. That's why it's a bit harder than the standard process. You need to explain not only your circumstances, but why you missed the deadline and why it's late and you're going through this appeals process. And the further away from the extenuation deadline you are, the more difficult it is to provide a late extenuation appeal without some type of evidence of why you're submitting late. If you don't have evidence, of course, still submit your appeal, but it may be difficult to get your appeal accepted without providing evidence. Basically, if you have the evidence, submit it. If not, try without it, but make sure to give a strong and clear explanation as to why it's late and see what happens from there. But be prepared that they might come back to you and ask for evidence in order to consider your claim. So how do you apply? So we'll make sure to put the link in the description. You can also search UEL Student Appeals and get access to the form. So it's right at the bottom of the appeals page. And as we mentioned, a lot of the information is quite self-explanatory. Your personal details, your name, your student number, email address, contact information, the school and the course that you're on. They ask information about learning difficulties or disabilities, and this form is also used for complaints, so make sure to tick the appeal box. You can add more than one assessment to it, but what you need for each one of those is this information here. So you would need to have the module code. So this is typically 2 letters and 4 numbers. The module name, so the actual name of the module, the component code. So this is related to the actual assessment itself, and typically is 3 numbers. And within a module, the first assessment is normally 001, the second one 002. So have a look on Moodle or UAL Direct to find this information, as all of this information, as you can see, is compulsory, and without that it's probably going to cause issues in being able to submit the form. You need to put the year, so this is the year that you had those assessments, the term, or the semester, the grade or award if you received it. If you didn't, again, you need to make sure you fill something in this box. So if you don't have that, put NA, and again with the result date. So here you would select the ground, and if it is a latent extenuation appeal, it would be this one here, unable to attend or submit assessments due to illness or other good cause and didn't meet the extenuation deadline. So that's the grounds that which you would select here, and you would add that there. So the next bit here is ticking yes. So you would tick yes to are you submitting a late appeal, and this will provide you with this box. So this is the box where you need to explain why you were unable to submit by the extenuation claim deadline. And it's not enough here to simply say, I didn't know. We find that appeals are more successful if the reason for the extenuation claim not being submitted was due to personal circumstances. So it could be around mental health issues, which were meaning that it affected your motivation and has impacted you in being able to apply before the deadline. Those kind of things are going to be more successful here. As you can see, you get 600 characters, so that's not much. So it's characters, not words. So this section is likely to be best kept brief. The second bit here is details of your appeal. So this is where you would explain your extenuating circumstances at the time of when you were doing the assessments. Again, not too lengthy, but make sure as well as describing the actual circumstances, you also explain the impact these circumstances had on you. And finally, as you can see here, it talks about the supporting evidence. So there isn't an option to attach it. You will need to email it across to the appeals team at appeals@uel.ac.uk. Make sure, and we would recommend to just send your evidence straight away, referencing that you've just submitted a late extenuation appeal, and attach the evidence. So that's what the actual form looks like. What happens if your appeal is successful? So in most cases, if you are wanting to have an extenuation applied and needing to do it via this late extenuation appeal process, because the extenuation deadline has passed, the 7 additional days an extenuation claim gives you, is probably no longer useful or relevant or way gone. However, if your appeal is successful and extenuation is applied, it does mean that your resit opportunity will be uncapped. So if you failed the initial attempt or were unable to submit the work by the deadline, and that you will be able to submit at the resit. A successful late extenuation appeal means that your resit mark will be uncapped. If it's the case where you've failed the entire module, you will need extenuation to be applied to both your first and second attempts for your repeat module to be uncapped. And if you did submit your work on the 7-day extenuation link, but didn't go through the official extenuation claim process, if you were able to do an extenuation appeal and that was successful, this would allow that work to be marked. So thanks for watching. That's our webinar on late extenuation appeals.